In May 1945, the guns fell silent, but for millions of German soldiers, the war did not end. Entire armies surrendered at once, overwhelming Allied forces. Their fate now depended on who captured them. Some entered structured Western camps, others were sent east into years of harsh labor. Many expected to return within weeks, some waited a decade. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Allies were suddenly responsible for more than 11 million German POWs. These men surrendered in waves across Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Germany itself. Many laid down their arms to the Western Allies to avoid falling into Soviet hands, but capacity everywhere was strained. The United States created a temporary classification known as disarmed enemy forces, used for large numbers of troops held in open-air enclosures rather than established POW camps. The US constructed vast holding areas such as the Rhine Meadows camp, where shortages of food, shelter, and medical supplies reflected the chaos of the immediate post-war months. Britain faced similar overcrowding. In Northwest Europe, capture points were overwhelmed as tens of thousands surrendered daily. Camps in Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually the United Kingdom itself, such as Camp 165 Watton, Eden Camp, and Culti-Bragan, took in ever-growing numbers. British authorities quickly organized registration, security screening, and transport. For those captured by the Soviet Union, the experience unfolded along a different path. Soviet forces held more than 3 million German soldiers by the end of 1945. Many were marched east to collection points in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, before transfer to labor camps across the Soviet interior. These transports were often long and conducted under difficult conditions. Mortality rates were significantly higher than in the West, a fact widely documented in both Soviet archival material and post-war German accounts. The Soviet government regarded POW labor as part of war reparations, which shaped all aspects of prisoner management. By late 1945, Western camps finally stabilized. Emergency tents gave way to permanent shelters, food distribution normalized, and medical care became routine. In the Soviet zone, conditions varied widely, but most prisoners were sent directly into labor. Everywhere, the priority in 1945 was the same: restore basic order. The long-term systems of denazification and investigation would come later. By late 1945, the sheer number of German POWs made one thing certain: the Allies needed labor. Cities were destroyed, rail networks broken, and millions of civilians relied on emergency reconstruction. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, POW labor was permitted, and Western governments used this framework to organize large work programs. In the Soviet Union, the rationale differed. German prisoners were seen as a source of reparations, and their deployment reflected this priority. They were assigned to industries with severe manpower shortages: mining in the Donbass and Urals, timber work in Siberia, steel and machinery repair in Magnitogorsk, and construction projects in Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Conditions varied depending on the region, command structure, and supply lines. Illness, limited rations, and harsh winters made work difficult, though Soviet archival records show gradual improvements after 1947 as reconstruction needs changed. In France, German POW labor became a cornerstone of national recovery. Roughly 740,000 prisoners transferred from US custody or captured in France itself were deployed across the country between 1945 and 47. They rebuilt bridges destroyed during the war, reconstructed factories in Normandy, repaired ports in Brest and Le Havre. French government records show that POW labor sometimes supplied more than half the workforce on major rebuilding projects. The United Kingdom used labor primarily for agriculture. Britain faced food shortages and an urgent need to increase domestic production. By 1946, over 400,000 German POWs lived in British-run camps, many arriving through transit points in Belgium and the Netherlands. They harvested crops, cleared bomb sites, repaired drainage systems, and worked in forestry across England, Scotland, and Wales. The camps became familiar names to local communities. Payment was symbolic, following Geneva Convention provisions, but many POWs described this period as stable compared to earlier months of captivity. Smaller labor contingents existed elsewhere. Belgium used German POWs in coal mining and public works. Canada employed them in agriculture and logging until reparation accelerated in 1946. Czechoslovakia, dealing with wartime devastation, also used POW labor domestically. A consistent theme across all Allied powers was time. None intended to hold millions of prisoners indefinitely, but labor shortages slowed reparation. The need for construction collided with political pressure to send men home. By 1948, these tensions defined debates in Western Europe and shaped decisions to accelerate releases even as major projects continued. For millions of POWs, the war had ended, but compulsory labor defined their everyday lives. Their work rebuilt Europe, often far from the homes they hoped to see again. As the POW labor system expanded, the Allies also faced a parallel task: determining which German prisoners were simply soldiers and which carried responsibility for wartime crimes. Screening began immediately in May 1945 and continued for years. Every major Allied power used its own system, but all drew on precedents set by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. In the US and British zones, POWs filled out detailed questionnaires intended to reveal political affiliation, SS membership, or roles in security organizations. These forms fed into the broader denazification programs, which classified individuals into categories ranging from major offenders to exonerated. Most POWs fell into the lower categories and were eventually cleared for release, but thousands faced further investigation. Intelligence units such as the US Counterintelligence Corps teams interviewed selected prisoners, looking for members of the Gestapo, SD, or individuals connected to crimes in occupied territories. Camps developed their own rhythms while this process unfolded. In British and American captivity, daily life gradually stabilized after the chaotic first months. POWs received mail through the International Committee of the Red Cross, formed sports teams, attended language classes, and even produced newspapers. Educational programs expanded in 1946, especially in the UK, where re-education initiatives centered on democratic values, current affairs, and modern history. Participation was voluntary, but thousands enrolled. French camps varied more widely. Some POWs worked long hours in reconstruction projects with little time for organized activities. Others lived in more settled conditions, receiving visits from German clergy and Red Cross inspectors. Camp reports show a gradual improvement in food and shelter as France's own recovery advanced. A minority of POWs were transferred to French courts for suspected wartime offenses, particularly those connected to collaborationist authorities or actions during the occupation. In the Soviet Union, the system took a different form. POWs underwent ideological instruction overseen by anti-fascist committees, which encouraged public renunciation of Nazism and participation in political education. Some prisoners embraced these programs, others viewed them as compulsory. Soviet archival records show extensive documentation of political meetings, lectures, and cultural activities, though conditions remained tied closely to local camp administration and labor demands. Food shortages, disease, and difficult winters posed continual challenges. Many Soviet-held POWs later wrote memoirs describing these hardships. Across all zones, uncertainty shaped prisoner morale. Men waited months or years without clear information on when they would return home. Rumors circulated constantly: large releases, sudden transfers, new trials. Families in Germany faced their own challenges locating relatives through the Red Cross tracing service, especially in areas now controlled by the Soviet administration. Despite these pressures, many prisoners built small communities within the camps. They marked Christmas and Easter with improvised ceremonies, organized choirs, and maintained diaries that later became important historical sources. Some prisoners formed lasting friendships with local civilians, especially in rural Britain and France. By 1946, most German POWs believed release was close. In the Western zones, this was partly true. The United States, facing domestic pressure and decreasing labor needs, began large-scale repatriations that year. Many prisoners were transported to Friedland, a reception camp in the British zone that became the main gateway back into post-war Germany. By early 1947, most American camps still holding POWs had transferred their remaining groups to Britain and France, or returned them directly to Germany. In the United Kingdom, the process moved more slowly. Britain relied heavily on POW labor to support agriculture and rebuild infrastructure. As a result, German prisoners remained central to the workforce through the 1947 harvest. Repatriation accelerated only after the British government announced a phased release program. By December 1948, most had returned home, although several thousand chose to remain voluntarily as civilian workers. British records showed that many of these men married locally or found stable employment and preferred to stay rather than return to a devastated Germany. France followed a similar trajectory, but with a greater tension. Having lost large portions of the industrial base during the occupation, France depended on POW labor for reconstruction, especially in mining and public works. French authorities initially postponed large-scale repatriation because reconstruction targets were not yet met. Diplomatic pressure from the United States and growing public debate inside France shifted policy in 1947-48. Releases increased, and by 1949, nearly all POWs had returned to Germany. A small number remained to finish contracts voluntarily. The slowest and most complex repatriations occurred in the Soviet Union. Soviet archives show that more than 2 million German POWs were still held in 1946, dispersed across hundreds of labor camps. Mortality had declined from the severe shortages of 1945, but food, transport, and medical care remained inconsistent. Since the Soviet government viewed POW labor as part of wartime reparations, and captives were assigned to long-term industrial and construction projects, releases began in late 1947 but remained limited. Large transports occurred in 1948 and 49, yet thousands, especially those convicted of war crimes, remained imprisoned. The final chapter of the POW story started in 1955, a full decade after the war. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow in September to negotiate the release of the remaining German prisoners. Soviet leadership agreed to free the last major group, including many men convicted in Soviet courts. In October 1955, trains carrying these POWs arrived at Friedland, where thousands of families gathered to welcome them home. Photographs of the arrivals became enduring images of post-war German memory. Returning prisoners entered a country that had changed profoundly. Germany was divided into East and West, and both states used POW experiences in different ways. West Germany framed their return as part of national recovery and reintegration, while East Germany highlighted anti-fascist re-education among Soviet-held prisoners. Many men underwent additional denazification hearings, often symbolic, by the early 1950s. Reintegration was not always simple. Some prisoners struggled to reconnect with families, rebuild careers, or adjust after years of forced labor. Others recorded their experiences in diaries and memoirs that later became significant historical sources. By 1956, the POW era was effectively over. Millions had returned, shaped by years of captivity that continued long after the fighting ended. Their journey home was one of the longest legacies of the war. If you enjoyed this video, watch What Happened to the Waffen-SS After World War II next. And as always, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside. And we'll see you in the next one.